Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 51st and penultimate week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcome, and I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you also find comments from viewers and some answers from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com. I'm happy to receive your comments. It's December 19th. On this day, 16 years ago, President Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives, only the second president of the United States ever to be impeached. He was impeached on two charges, one of perjury, as lying to a grand jury, and one of obstruction of justice, witness tampering. And not, by the way, for sexual dalliance with an intern, as his defenders say. He was guilty on both charges, but the Senate did not remove him from office, even though he had been impeached, defeating the beneficial purposes for which the archaic process of impeachment was left in the federal Constitution. If he had been removed from office, so that his Vice President Al Gore had become president, George Bush would probably not have become president in the year 2000. He would have been running against an incumbent president. If the precedent had been established with Clinton impeachment, then Bush and Obama could have been impeached and removed, which would have benefited the country. Now there's practically no chance that impeachment and removal from office will be exercised in the American polity anytime soon. The big news for the week is Obama's change of mind, if that's what it is, in regard to Cuba, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But first, we'll go to Ron Szoke.
Yes, well, I want to raise again the topic I keep harping on endlessly, and that is inequality. A new report, the Pew Research Center has found that the U.S. wealth gap has hit a record high. It keeps happening again and again. The wealth gap between the country's upper income and middle-class families has risen to a record high, according to a new study from the Pew Research Center. The survey, based on 30 years of Federal Reserve data, shows the gap between upper and lower income families also has climbed to an all-time peak. The median wealth of upper income families totaled $639,400 last year, 6.6 times the median wealth of middle income families, which is $96,500. And that compares with 4.5 times in 2007, the year before the financial crisis. These figures tend to become a blur, but so I'll lay off that. In addition, the median net worth of upper income families tops the median of lower income families by 68.8 times. The latest data reinforce the larger story of America's middle-class household wealth stagnation over the past 3 decades. The report states the Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz says that growing income inequality has taken a major toll on children. It was a part of this report that they would tell us about the percentage of children living in poverty in 35 countries around the world, relatively advanced countries. And has anyone heard where the USA came out in the list? 34th of the
not
35.
top. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Although he said the average American childhood may not be the worst in the world, the disparity between the country's wealth and the condition of its children is unparalleled. The childhood poverty rate in the USA is 19.9%, the highest among developed countries except Romania. So, hey, we're not at the absolute bottom, right? None of this is because Americans do not care about their children, Stiglitz says. It's because America has embraced a policy agenda in recent decades that has caused its economy to become wildly unequal, leaving the most vulnerable segments of society further and further behind. So we keep getting this report week after week, month after month, and year after year, and now it appears decade after decade. Why does this keep happening? Don't people understand the consequences of this? Is our economic system compatible with human decency and dignity? The institutions that are supposed to provide us with equality, happiness, or the pursuit of happiness, liberty, and so on. And it's beginning to look more and more as if there's some merit in what the people say who say that the economic system that we have, and system of taxation anyway, are incompatible with the institutions that we're trying to depend upon to provide human decency and dignity for most Americans. So they go on to ask, should there be a wealth tax in addition to the income tax?
Why in addition?
Yeah, well.
Why not instead?
Right. There are strong, well, they don't say that. There are strong pro-wealth forces in the upscale wing of the Democratic Party, as well as the Republicans. This says many center-left economists are wary of raising taxes on wealth as opposed to income. They cite the fear of creating disincentives to innovation. Let's take these one by one. The flight of wealth to low-tax havens and the establishment of new tax avoidance schemes here in America.
Oh, my.
An economist at MIT, Daron Acemoglu, I don't know how to pronounce that, who supports more public investment in education, infrastructure, and social services, wrote to me that a wealth tax would prove, quote, very distortionary and naturally discouraging of saving, not a good thing in the current U.S. context. I don't know where he's getting this. Anyway, there's the picture.
I think it's the water in the Charles River.
That could be it. Love that dirty water, as the Vandell sang a generation ago. Probably 2 generations now.
Meanwhile, subpoint 2, America's rich are giving less of their wealth to charity. You propose this kind of thesis to a number of our more conservative colleagues, and they say, well, churches, charities, wealthy benefactors, philanthropists will take care of the worst social needs.
Wow.
And I've heard that one again and again, and it just isn't true. The charities say there's no way, especially the religious ones, that they can begin to cope with the problems that are out there in society of poverty, deprivation, and so on.
Well, not that they can't cope, but they won't, eh?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, right.
taxing their wealth in order to do those things could accomplish it.
The amount of money wealthy Americans are donating to charity is falling as a percentage of their income. Before you denounce the 1%, this says, new research finds that they're being more charitable on a per dollar basis, but their wealth is increasing even more than their charitable giving.
On a per dollar basis. It's an interesting way to put it.
So they're giving more dollars,
yes.
the very rich, but it's a smaller percentage.
But less and less a percentage of their
Right,
wealth
right.
of their wealth or their income.
Yeah. So the average dollar amount given to charity by wealthy donors increased to $68,000 from $53,000, the report found. But average giving as a percentage of household income decreased by 1 percentage point as increase of income levels outpaced increases in charitable giving. So the report goes on to say the wealthy Americans are indeed giving more in terms of dollars, but that study was far more pessimistic about the extent to which their charitable giving would increase as a percentage.
Maybe it's appropriate for Christmas week, but there's something possibly Dickensian about this,
Yes,
you know.
yes.
Scrooge in the county house, or Oliver Twist, more, please, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, if rich people would just, you know, become a little nicer, if Scrooge would become, we wouldn't have a
Right.
problem. I mean, this is a level of discussion that, you know, that Dickens would have laughed at.
Right. So, the wealthy don't want money taken away from them.
What a surprise.
Coercively, by taxes, confiscation, they call
That's
it.
how they got to be wealthy,
Exactly.
Right.
from not having money taken away from them.
They instead want it all to be voluntary, charitable, so they can feel good about their benevolence. So, what do you think of that?
I think you know we're at the end of this year, 2014, and this is our last show since we won't be doing a show next week. This has been one of the landmarks of this year in terms of shaping the debate was, of course, the publication of Thomas Piketty's book about capital in the 21st
Exactly.
century. And what Piketty pointed out was that after World War II, when much of the world lay in ruins and we were kind of starting a little bit fresh, even in this country, that the ratio of income to wealth was only something like 1 to 3. And that now, 60 years, 70 years later, the ratio of income in our country, and broadly speaking in Europe and the other developed countries as well, the ratio of income, the money that circulates in the economy every year, versus wealth, the money that people have socked away, whether it's in assets or stocks or bonds or homes, is something like 1 to 5. So what we're talking about in this, to put it in terms that people can understand now in terms of current dollars, we're talking about a GDP, an income of $17 trillion. And we're talking about wealth of something like, if you multiply that by 5, you get $85 trillion. Now more and more higher percentages of that are in the stock market. Higher percentages of that wealth, where did that wealth come from? It was taken from income. It's money that people have made, whether they made it now or whether their ancestors made it 300 years ago by selling slaves. You know, that's the same money that redounds to the wealth of families and the endowments of institutions, including higher ed and all the other foundations that we read about, who are supposed to be helping people out, supposedly. All of this money has but increasing amounts of that income, when they become wealth, are taken out of the system. They don't circulate anymore. So the economy is impoverished in various ways, and the government itself is impoverished in ways in terms of spending the money that needs to be spent to put people to work, to provide people with what they need. So I think it's important to understand what that relationship is between income and wealth, and how little wealth really has to do with making the economy work. It's basically people taking money out of the economy and saying it's not going to work, or it's going to be speculated on. And that is a fundamental problem with wealth. You don't expect people to take risks with their wealth unless they really have to. And when they do, it's often risks that don't actually amount to anything of value. So that's what we've found out in our economy in the last few years as we've gone through boom and bust. We can no longer afford to have this financialized economy anymore, in which so much of the money in wealth and so much of the wealth is in stocks and bonds in a way that not only does it not benefit the economy in various ways because of the power of the wealth, it stifles the economy. They use their money to prevent the government from doing what it must do. And I guess the final point I make, and this refers back to my my mentioning of something called modern monetary theory in terms of the government's ability to print money, to put in the economy, to circulate in terms of the things that people need. One wouldn't necessarily have to get that money from wealth or from a tax on wealth. What these people are arguing is that the government can create that money, can create that currency, circulate it. It's neither here nor there what wealthy people do with their wealth, although they can do all kinds of either good or bad things with that. But we shouldn't have to wait for a wealth tax, an income tax, or even borrowing, or even the federal government borrowing money when the government has the power, when there is labor that is not being used and when there are resources not being used. The government can, in very good faith and very wisely, print, in a sense, print the money to put people to work creating the things that people need.
This is the mistake the libertarians make on economic matters. The libertarians, in fact, seem to me to have some very important things to say to us on various other matters, including foreign policy and interventionism, where the libertarian tradition is actually one of the few critiques that's extant at the moment of the agreement of both our major political parties on foreign policy. But on this fundamental libertarian notion the country is broke, so forth and so on, that's nonsense, and it's worthwhile to say that it's nonsense. And modern monetary theory that you're talking about, David, of course, does exactly this, and gives us another basis to talk about the problem that Ron's raised here. It seems to me that there's two particular aspects of the problem. One having to do with taxes, the fact that wealth, that as Thomas Piketty says in the conclusion of his important and massive study, the first thing that has to be done is that the tax burden has to be shifted from income to wealth, and wealth needs to be taxed in order to prevent the accumulation in the direction that we've been talking about. But the second thing is the question of how that wealth is being used, and indeed who's making the decisions on how that wealth is being used. The word capital is, of course, ambiguous, as we know. I mean, sometimes it refers to money, and sometimes, more importantly, that money in large enough piles refers to productive property. That is, what you can buy with that money. Farms, factories, fields, the things you need in order to produce food, clothing, and shelter that humanity needs, after all. Now, the employment of productive property, which becomes the question of the employment of capital, the money that stands for that productive property, those decisions are made in this society privately. Elderly gentlemen sitting in boardrooms in New York, people almost our age, are making decisions on how this money is being used, how this capital is being invested, how that productive property is being used, and therefore what jobs are available in the society. And they bring us everything from, striped toothpaste to, candy bars. I mean, the idea of investment for public good, of using productive property for the benefit of the society, is, it's argued, what would come of having a greater democratic control over those investment decisions. So the concentration of wealth that Piketty analyzes, and that you've just summarized, David, seems to me to raise serious questions, not only about the current running of the government, but the fundamental system whereby labor and productive resources are put together. I mean, it's just a society that's gone mad, that has all sorts of work of to be done, and legions of people who need the work and need the income, and it can't put them together, because it can put them together only when you can make more money for those who already control wealth.
And it should be stressed that when you put those people to work and they go to buy the basic goods, the food and clothing and shelter that they need, there will be plenty of that for them. The market will provide that. It just hasn't provided them with the jobs. We are capable of produce. Obviously, we are capable of producing that food and clothing and shelter and the basic things that people need in their homes and in their lives. It doesn't mean everyone can be rich, but what the quote unquote free market can provide is what people need at a basic concrete level. But it's the government that has to put them to work to create demand for the people who are in turn producing those things.
Periodically, money gets moved from the income statement over to the balance sheet, and there it becomes largely inert if there's enough of it lying around. And it doesn't help anyone anymore, except a very tiny group of people who already have far too much.
It's a complex issue, but I mean, I think the one kind of myth that people need to be disabused of is that money in the stock market is being invested in helping to produce things better. I mean, it can be invested for that in some ways. That argument can be made, but by and large, the money in the stock market it's just there. It's not going to actually put people to work. You know, it isn't often used in that way. It's used to increase the value of companies, and increasingly as the financialized economy has revolved around shareholder value, around the theory of shareholder value, what corporations do with their profits is buy back their stock in order to raise the price of that stock. So we have this very vicious cycle where it doesn't matter how well companies are doing in a concrete sense in employment. It's a matter of how much profit they can make, even if it's making profit, say, off of the kind of domination of the drug industry, where they have patents that inflate the price of drugs. These things don't help the public good, but they do make the shareholders of those and the CEOs and boards and so forth of those companies rich.
Yeah, I recently ran across a very interesting little book by Jeff Madrick.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Called
Madrick
Seven Bad Ideas.
Yeah.
And haven't got very far into it yet.
You've only got a few bad ideas.
Right. But he starts off with the invisible hand, Adam Smith's superstition about the invisible hand reconciling all these interests and producing the greater good for the greater number and so on. And he talks about Say's law, which is a little hard for me to grasp, I think. What actually is it saying? That production tends to create its own demand somehow, something of the kind. And again, that seems very mysterious to me. Is this an example of superstition or magical thinking?
It would in a sense it would if the workers were paid all the value of what they produce in order to buy that. But that isn't the way capitalism works. And of course, this is what's been well understood for a long time, since Marx, if not before then, that the capitalism will cut off its nose to spite its face by not paying workers enough to keep the profits going and them working.
Yeah, so that book is available in the Urbana Free Library.
Yeah.
And it goes into a number of different types of economics. It essentially is talking about the extent to which our professional and academic economists have betrayed us. They have such a narrow view and such restricted assumptions about how we should look at things that they need to think more about other types of economic thought: behavioral, institutional, historical, evolutionary, and maybe even positive economics, which is the mathematical, pseudoscientific kind.
It's just political economy, good old-fashioned macroeconomics, what was called political economy in the 19th century, an understanding of how the national income is working. That's what's really lacking. Other economics may have their value at some technical level or some understanding of business and marketing and so forth. But what the biases of the economics profession, and Dean Baker kind of harps on this on his blog every single day, is that they don't seem to understand what should be being taught to freshmen in college if micro is econ 100 and macro is econ 101, this is what they should be understanding by the time they're about 19.
And it's no accident, of course, if they don't. I mean, the people who are teaching those courses and so forth are employed by the very folks whose wealth they are defending, in a sense. And until we realize that, and realize that the discussion must include more of the community, we're not going to get very far. What we're going to hear is the kept economists on all sides. The reason Piketty is such a phenomenon, and given that what he's saying is relatively simple and straightforward, is that he does it in the midst of an economics profession, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the neoliberal movement. It's important to see that some of the questions we're talking about tonight were a matter of general discussion 40 years ago. The Nixon administration came close to establishing something that would have been a guaranteed annual income for all Americans. You tell most people that these days, this is Nixon administration in the 1970s, 40 years ago. You tell people that today and they say, oh no, I know Nixon was a bad guy and so forth and so on. And of course, he never could have done anything like that. Well, whatever Nixon's own character was, and reflecting on the character of presidents is perhaps a dangerous exercise, whatever his own character was, it was the case that in the 1970s it was a matter of common discussion by Republicans as well as Democrats over how one can establish an income base for all Americans. A guaranteed annual income at the basis of a living wage. Now that discussion has dropped out. That discussion has gone away. No one would welcome that sort of discussion right now. No one would expect, at least, might welcome it. They wouldn't expect that sort of discussion right now. And the reason they would not, is that we've had 40 years of a conscious, business-oriented campaign to restrict the questions to a narrow set of issues. For example, should we have a flat tax or a progressive tax? Mm-hmm. That's the issue. The one side says flat, the other side says progressive, right, left, so forth and so on. You got your discussion going, and you don't have to worry about the outcome, because whatever the outcome is not going to affect the people who control wealth.
Now we all bow down to the great God, general equilibrium. And,
and that's, yeah, and that, I mean, this relates, I mean, one aspect of all this nonsense is the demonization of the federal debt, which can be looked at in various ways, and it's possible for the government to go too much into debt, especially if that debt is flying out of the country when there's a trade deficit at the same time. But there's just no reason, while we fetishize the federal government not being in debt, we find that households are in debt, and those two things are related to each other, because again, as modern monetary theory points out, the only way that the three general aspects of the economy, businesses, households, and government, the only way that businesses and households in the long run can be in surplus is if the government is in debt. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on the program, every time the federal government runs a surplus, the economy flatlines. Historically, that's the way it works. It causes a depression when the federal government attempts to run a surplus. The last time, which was in the late 90s, right before the dot-com bubble burst, and then a few years later, the housing bubble burst.
Don't we desperately need a balanced budget?
Not at the federal, yeah. Families need balanced budgets relatively over a long period of time. Governments that issue their own currency don't. Yeah. It's as simple as that, because they can always print the money to pay off their debt, and they don't pay off the principal of that debt anyway. They only pay interest on that debt.
How can you preach that to people who don't believe in macroeconomics?
Well, I think a big, I've come to believe, those people, I think that it behooves someone like me to try to explain to people, to try to understand things well enough to be able to explain them in simple terms. And I think that's possible. I think that there's a lot going on, a lot of ferment in that area. There are a lot of people trying to do that, and I hope we see some real consciousness raising in the coming years in this regard. And if there's not, things are just going to get worse and worse.
Sure.
And
I'm ready to drop that. Tom.
One of the simplest ways of putting that was that chosen by the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith in his book *The Affluent Society* of 2 generations ago, where he pointed out simply, no one turns down a check signed by the government of the United States. Now, this.
Yeah.
No one refuses to cash a check signed by the government of the United States. Now, that's the important point that the neoliberal counterattack of the last 40 years has wanted us to ignore and not pay any attention to say, well, we haven't got the money for this. We can't possibly support people in this country. A shocking example of that occurred just this week when the governor of Vermont, who was elected governor in part because he said we're going to set up a state single-payer system for health care here in Vermont. There'd been a press for he wasn't the first one to mention it. There was press for it in Vermont for a while. The people who knew that single-payer, that is government-paid health care, came to Canada, as it's come to the other advanced industrialized countries, from the sort of the state level, in Canada the province level, and moved up to the federal level. That's how it happened in Canada. And the folks in Vermont were saying, well, we can do that here. And there have been attempts in other states to do that too, including Hawaii, and even, remarkably enough, the state of Illinois. Now, the governor of Vermont, who was elected on a pledge to try to establish a state single-payer system, announced this week that he'd been talking to the economists, and the economists had explained to him that this really wasn't possible. We can't do that in Vermont. And so he said, regrettably, the plans for a Vermont single-payer system have been shelved. Well, the outrage is amazing because, of course, these economists are the same people we've been talking about, the folks who are working for the neoliberal movement and who are shocked at the notion that the society actually can provide things that people need, like health care.
Yeah, well, one more remark. Notorious case, Larry Summers, who's lent his name and prestige and academic credentials to a lot of these measures. And it's another long story, but there are a number of academic economists who have become multimillionaires by that route.
Well, John Maynard Keynes said that he made his money, you know, by reading the stock pages in the morning before he got out of bed. So, you're watching News from Neptune. It's about 1:30, and we have many things on the table to talk about.
Cuba.
What should we turn to? David, did you have something else
well,
you wanted to
Well, I know you
specifically
mentioned Cuba before.
Yeah.
We need to talk about Cuba, but and I think I want to mention fracking as well, because two things. Because as we sit here complaining and moaning and doomsaying at the end of this year, at least we've been brightened.
To be said, I'm afraid.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We should point out that a couple of sort of pleasantly surprising things have happened just within the last 24 hours or 48 hours. One is the sort of partial, not complete recognition or complete normalization of relations with Cuba, and the other is not related in any way that I can think of, is the fact that basically Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, was basically forced to ban fracking. I mean, it wasn't. If you saw Democracy Now! This morning, you saw his talk, the few words he had to say. You can see that he wasn't terribly enthusiastic about this. One got the feeling that the law of that state and the activists in that state had basically won. It won against him and the kind of people that give him, that certainly as a neoliberal governor, give him lots of money and would like to do lots of fracking in that state. So good on them in New York. And I can only refer to the at the same time, since the price of oil has been falling so low, fracking isn't going to be profitable anyway.
Precisely.
And so in that light, we must look at the recent endorsement of fracking of the editors of the News Gazette and say that either their view is, I mean, it was a bad view even when the price of oil was high. Now it's, I mean, it was already a bad view, or a bad program, and I don't expect any apologies or any backpedaling on that from them. But we don't need fracking in this state, and hopefully this will begin to stop it in its tracks. But back to Cuba, I guess the one comment I would like to put on the table for that is that this isn't a change in strategy. Again, it's a victory of a sort of Cuba against the efforts of our country to overthrow their government for the last 55 years.
Exactly.
And it also isn't anything that we can just, in the same way we can credit Andrew Cuomo, maybe this is where the parallel could be drawn, for doing what he sort of was forced to do by relatively democratic processes. We can credit Obama with doing what he was forced to do by both the resistance of Cuba itself and the resistance of those Latin American nations and leaders who have changed the political tone of this hemisphere to one in which the U.S. government, which still wants the same strategy, which still has the same goals, which wants to control this hemisphere as it has felt it was its right to do since, we all learn about the Monroe Doctrine, which is now nearly 200 years old. But they're being forced to go about that in a different way, in a way that perhaps will see Cuba as one of the, since it's so close to us, and can be perhaps influenced by bringing them closer instead of pushing them farther. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But again, it's a victory for Cuba and for democratic forces in this hemisphere, and it's causing what is known in foreign policy circles as a change of course as the American ruling class pursues its interests in relation to the Western Hemisphere.
David, you're more full of Christmas spirit than I am, I'm afraid, on these issues. More generous, more forgiving.
But you can call it Hanukkah spirit.
Hey, your choice. On both these issues, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to light candles either on fracking or on Cuba in regard to what the American government is doing. I mean, to our friends over at the News Gazette are often a day late and a dollar short on issues like this, and I think they might be that even in their praise for fracking that you called them on a moment ago. I mean, the important point is that the international economic situation has changed. Oil is selling now at about 50% of what it was selling 6 months ago, and that's not an accident, although there seems to be a remarkable agreement not to notice why that's the case. The case is directly involved with American policy, American government policy, as it has been at least since the Second World War. Oil as the major commodity in international trade has been a primary concern of American policymakers since the U.S. assumed control of the world economy at the end of the Second World War. That didn't happen. It didn't happen that the U.S. woke up one morning and said, "Oh, look at that! The price of oil is coming down. What a surprise!" But you're quite right about its effect on the fracking debate. I mean, I think it's actually a riot that Cuomo, who is immensely business friendly, is thoroughly neoliberal and so forth, suddenly should find out that fracking is not good for us. Of course, it does happen just after we find out that fracking's not making us any money either. So we may be dealing with things that are bound up together here. Now, coming to Cuba, which, as you point out, we're talking about the most terrorized state in possibly in the world, but certainly in the Western Hemisphere. and that 2 generations also of American presidents have loosed what John Kennedy called the terrors of the earth on Cuba, because they made the elementary mistake of throwing out the government that we'd arranged for them. And countries are not allowed to do that. The remarkable thing is that Cuba has got away with it now for almost 50 years. Now, this is remarkable, but I don't think we should, as in the case of Mr. Cuomo, I don't think we should praise our leaders for sudden enlightenment. As you suggested, this is not incompatible with the sort of policy that led to our killing Cubans for 50 years. On the same day that we hear more from the Obama government, from the Obama administration, about what it's going to do about regularizing relations with Cuba, Obama also signs a law setting sanctions on Crimea, because they had the temerity to vote for union with Russia, and Venezuela, which, as we know, for a long time has not been obeying orders from Washington about how that country should be run. And in fact, the very day that the Cuban announcement is made, American strictures, American sanctions on Venezuela were strengthened. So I think we have to understand what the U.S. government is doing here in terms with what the Obama administration is doing in regard to Cuba, in terms of the ongoing U.S. policy. What's changed in Latin America from the days when the U.S. could terrorize the Cuban government and work for its overthrow, up to and including the exploding cigars that were supposed to blow Castro's head off, according to the CIA plans. What's changed is a revolution, a long-term revolution in Latin America, in a reassertion of the independence of Latin states across the continent. And the U.S. finds itself marginalized, surrounded in the Western Hemisphere in a way it hasn't ever, as you pointed out, from the time of the Monroe Doctrine. So I think we see this making nice with Cuba as being an attempt to pursue the same American goals in a new situation where the Latin states cannot be coerced as they once could, and therefore some deals have to be done. They're doing a deal.
Yeah, this leads to the old joke about the two sides of the isolating Cuba kind of remark. And we began to realize it was actually becoming isolated by this.
Yeah. Well, I think another complication of the Latin American issue and the sanctions on Venezuela is that Venezuela is a country that's going to be hurt and weakened by the lower price of oil. I mean, they of course need that price to be high to resist threats by the U.S., to resist efforts by the U.S., direct efforts by the U.S. to undermine its economy. So a lot of complicated things are going around in the world around oil and around the manner in which the global economy, and of course what goes unmentioned, which implicit in all this, is what the lower. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that the lower price of oil. I'm not sure. It sounds like Saudi Arabia is, in a sense, doing this, although it can't possibly be doing it without mostly the approval of Washington.
Exactly.
Although some argue that Saudi Arabia has a mind of its own. I'm not sure how much of its own its mind is.
It's a parallel, another state we have parallel arguments about.
Israel is, there are things that it can do, but there are limits to what it can do. And all this is going on in the context of weakening Russia, of course.
Yes.
And so I guess global politics is kind of interesting right now.
Well, one account said that John Kerry talked the Saudis into increasing or maintaining production.
Yeah.
And even though they wanted to, some of them wanted to decrease it. And so I don't know about that. But
I'm astonished at the reluctance of commentators in this country, every level, and there are a lot of motives for this. I'm astonished at the reluctance to notice the obvious fact that the sudden precipitous decline in oil prices serves the interests of the American administration and is done by its chief clients. Now, whose idea was this? I mean, did somebody rush into the Oval Office with a note to Mr. Obama, Sir, oil prices are falling. What, says Obama? That never occurred to us. Come on. I mean, this is nonsense. This is American policy. And it's American policy exercised by essentially the alliances that the U.S. uses to run Mideast policy. That is the alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's an alliance that is a matter of honor among thieves rather than a peaceful agreement, a contract to do good. But what's actually happens is that to put its policy in effect in the Middle East, the U.S. relies upon two pillars. One is the State of Israel, the other is Saudi Arabia. The long-term question, by the way, in the Middle East has to do for the fact that for a long time, American policy rested on a tripod. The third leg of the tripod was Iran. But the Iranians in 1979 had another idea about that, and the U.S. for a generation since then has been trying, as it were, to reestablish the tripod while it teetered along on the two legs of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Well, they managed to stomp on a lot of people on those two legs, and that's clearly what's going on now in terms of this oil crisis. As you pointed out, David, it hurts America's favorite bête noire in the Western Hemisphere, that is Venezuela, and even more importantly, it is a crucial element in this astonishing policy of the Obama government to destroy the Russian economy. And until we see that that's what the Obama government is doing, that they really are trying to do that, they're trying to do that with this notion that was set out in so many words by Obama's intellectual bodyguard, Zbigniew Brzezinski, 15 years ago, that control of Eurasia was central to American policy and to the profits of the American 1%, and that the U.S. could not allow a hegemon to arrive in Eurasia, Russia and China, that could actually challenge America's control of the world economy. Well, Obama learned his lessons well. And the Obama government is working very hard, amazingly hard, to make sure that doesn't happen, and they're willing to kill a lot of people in the process.
Carl, you've just ruined my Hanukkah spirit.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry about that, David, and it was only the fact that you egged me on.
And it's only the third. It's only the third night, or the fourth night. Imagine how bad it's going to be by the eighth night.
Well, a couple of minor points. The opening to Cuba is very partial. Congress has to act to remove the embargo, and tourists still can't go there and loll on the beach. Apparently, they have to have some pretext of doing something else. But and the pressure was building from American business that they, 11 million people in Cuba, 22 million armpits to deodorize, and
interesting way to put it.
But there's a fellow named Trita Parsi who's enlightened, but he represents Iranian, positive Iranian opinion in this country, opposed to the sanctions and everything. And he wrote, after the Cuba, maybe Iran will be next. He sort of said, well, if Obama's coming to his senses about Cuba, maybe he'll come to his senses about Iran too. And it sounds like what you're saying, Carl, is no way. That's just not the same game, and I would tend to agree with that. Although again, there's been pressure in the last month, we haven't really talked that much about these negotiations that were supposed to lead to something at the end of last month, but we've been waffling, and I haven't been. It isn't that I've been following it that closely. I'm just assuming that they're not really intended to go anywhere. There really isn't going to be a change of course vis-a-vis Iran, and the demonization of Iran in its own way is just as silly as that of Cuba. It's just as silly in one context that we've demonized Cuba for this long as we've demonized Iran for this long in terms of what we could get, say, from trading with them or making peace with them.
Is it in some way functional?
Let me try this one, Ron, because I want to get at the Hanukkah spirit again here. I think it's misleading our colleague just a bit.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's not a question of silliness. I mean, a couple of the phrases that you use there, I think represent, I think, a lot of the way we do talk about foreign policy in this country. That the government is doing something silly in foreign policy. Let's hope they come to their senses and do something that isn't so silly. Now, there's a model there, and I'm not saying that you're buying that model because I'm not. But there's a model under that a lot of commentators do buy that says here's the U.S. government just going along its normal everyday way, doing good stuff and searching for the good, and a crisis comes along, and let's just hope that the government can do the right thing, capital R, capital T, in a crisis, and so that it doesn't do something silly. And that is the sort of discussion we have in American politics all the time. And what that masks is the continuity of American policy and the intelligence with which it's conducted. Now, to say a policy is intelligent is not to say that it's right. In fact, an evil policy can be perfectly intelligent in this fashion, and that seems to me to what we're dealing with here in regard to the United States. Now, let's talk about the specific case of Iran. As I said a moment ago, the U.S. Government for a long time controlled what was the cornerstone of its foreign policy in many ways, Mideast energy resources, by this tripod of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. And since 1979, it hasn't had Iran as part of that arrangement. I think, in fact, what's going on in Washington right now, what Secretaryship of State is trying to do is reestablish that, to come to an arrangement with Iran where indeed Iran can be brought into the control of energy flows in the Middle East, which the U.S. considers so important in regard to, first of all, to Russia, in regard to its control of Eurasia. If we can get the Iranians back on board, we don't have to worry about the Iranians getting in bed with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is basically the Chinese and Russian economic arrangement for Eurasia. They're very worried about that in Washington. They're very worried about the possibility that might happen, and Kerry's working day and night to see that it doesn't. Now, there are problems there. There are very real problems. Problems in fitting even in with the, as Ron was pointing out, with the rhetoric that's gone before, with the demonization of Iran for a generation. A sudden change of mind, sort of like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, calls for some explanation. And this is what's at stake here. So the idea of trying to get Iran back on board with American worldwide economic policy is, I think, close to what's animating the Obama administration.
For a long time, some people have been going around saying, was it Jeremy Scahill, that Iran is our natural ally in the Middle East.
That's what we said from 1953 when we overthrew their democratic government and put in one that we liked, down to the 1970s when the Iranians said they would like another arrangement.
But we're forbidden from talking to them by the Israelis.
A phrase that's...
Well, but that's not... Now, wait a minute. I don't think that's quite right, Ron. It's not that we're forbidden by Israel to talk to them. It's that the control of forces in the Middle East means that the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the rivalry between Iran and Israel has to be figured into the American overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger said, that has to be reestablished. That's what they're trying to do. And it's not just because the Iranians don't like the Israelis don't like the Iranians. What we're dealing with is a much more serious issue. We're dealing with money.
Yeah, I would only add that, you know, I keep reading, and in the leftist press or the leftist alternative press, that Obama is leading us into a new Cold War, and that seems to be sort of a deceptive or not complete argument. It seems like the Cold War never ended.
Yes, I think that's an important point.
I think that's an important point for people to understand, that this isn't like, again, this isn't really a change of course in the larger strategic sense of the word. The one Cold War ended, and then it was revealed what the Cold War was really about, and of course it's still going on.
Or to put it another way, what happened was that the U.S. won the Cold War, such as it was, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then attempted to exercise what was finally economic control over the remnants of the Soviet Union, including Russia, and has been thwarted in that desire to some extent by the Putin regime in Russia. That's why they hate him so much. They're standing in the way of something that looked like working out very nicely, thank you, from the Clinton administration on.
This raises all kinds of problems for me. What was the Cold War?
Well, but these are questions we should be talking about. If we were really talking about the actual history of the country and so forth, that would be the issue.
We'll look forward to talking about these things in 2015.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 51st and penultimate week of 2014, a too little, too late edition. I don't even think I got a chance to explain that. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Szoke and David Green. I meant it didn't refer to Cuba, of course. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett, and to Dan tonight, particularly. Continuing programs, upcoming programs here on UPTV should be paid attention to. You won't see them elsewhere in Champaign-Urbana. And of course, listen to WRFU Radio, Living Simply, on the first Friday of the month, with Ron Szoke as host. Inshallah, we'll be back next week. No, not next week. 2 weeks, right?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. Inshallah, we'll be back Inshallah, we'll be back next year with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.